Hi there, my name is Susan Barnes, and I'm with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I am the Regional Wildlife Conservation Biologist for Northwestern Oregon. I've been a wildlife biologist for about 30 years and have a degree in wildlife management and forestry. I've been with ODFW for about 24 years now. I'm stationed in the Clackamas office, and I focus on all non-game wildlife, rare and declining species in particular, which unfortunately there are many, largely due to habitat loss, which we'll be talking about today. So just a quick overview of my presentation. I'll be talking about what wildlife habitat is, because it does mean different things to different people and different species, why habitat is important. Then I'll go over the four key components of wildlife habitat. I'll introduce microhabitats, which are very important. And then we'll focus in on some species and look at what different species or groups of species need. And then finally, I'll talk a bit about how to approach um, plan development, how to develop a habitat plan. So what is wildlife habitat? Well, it really depends on the critter, the species of wildlife. All wildlife need habitat, a place to live, but habitat means something different for different species of wildlife depending on its ecology. So wildlife habitat matches the needs and habits of a particular species. Suitable habitat provides the necessary resources or components that allows a species to survive, reproduce, and thrive into the future. So wildlife habitat is extremely variable, as each species of wildlife has particular needs and habits. And the way a particular species uses habitat changes through the seasons, right? Nesting habitat might be different than wintering habitat. So take these four different species of wildlife, for example. For the most part, they really have quite different habitat requirements. So, for example, black-tailed deer on the upper left are what we would call habitat generalists. So they can meet their life history needs in a variety of habitat types. Whereas the western meadowlark, our state bird on the upper right of this slide, are what we would call habitat specialists. They require big patches of grassland habitat with specific habitat components. Another example, western painted turtle, lower left, this species needs both aquatic habitat and upland habitats to survive and reproduce. For example, they need to be in water to swallow their food, and they need land to lay their eggs. And finally, the last example I've here on this slide would be one of our terrestrial salamander species, Ensatina. You may not even see this species. They live out their entire life cycle on land, usually under leaf litter, logs, or woody material. So all these species have different habitat requirements. So because of this variability, when thinking about creating and managing habitat for wildlife on your land, it's important to keep in mind that it's not possible to provide habitat for every species of wildlife everywhere for a variety of reasons. Every property is different. Also, it's important to acknowledge that what improves habitat for one species of wildlife actually might make it less suitable for another species, and that's okay. That said, your goal when managing your land for wildlife habitat ought to be to provide all components, key components of wildlife habitat, those being food, water, cover, and space. And while it's helpful to know specific species and what a specific species of wildlife needs, like what it eats and how and when it uses water, how much space it requires, in general, the goal in wildlife habitat creation and management is diversity and complexity. Um, providing a diversity of wildlife habitat generally supports the greatest number of species. And Oregon is home to a variety of different amphibians, birds, mammals, and reptiles, both game species and non-game species. And actually, about 85% of Oregon's fish and wildlife species fall into that non-game category. Many of our species are in trouble, on the decline. Even some of the species that we would consider or have considered as common, many of those species are on the decline. That said, there are a subset of native species that have been included on a list of what we call species of greatest conservation need in Oregon State Wildlife Action Plan, otherwise known as the Oregon Conservation Strategy, including several of the species here in this slide. The northwestern pond turtle, the western bluebird, silver-haired bat. These are all species that have been identified as declining and fall under the species of greatest conservation need category. So I'll provide a link to the Oregon Conservation Strategy on the final slide of this presentation, but just a quick snapshot of the strategy species of greatest conservation need. There actually are a total of 294 species identified in the strategy as being in greatest conservation need, and focusing in on the Willamette Valley and West Cascades ecoregion, in which Marion County falls within. Here's just a few examples, other examples of species that are of priority concern due to documented declines in their populations. So why are wildlife species on the decline? Well, the reasons are many and very complicated, but the primary reason for decline for any wildlife species is habitat loss, primarily from land use changes over time that have resulted in loss of habitat, whether it be from urban development as well as conversion to other land uses such as agriculture. Another reason for wildlife species on the decline is related to the introduction of invasive species, non-native invasive species, which outcompete our native species. Often they cause direct mortality. They prey upon our native species. Both plants and animals, and invasive plants degrade native habitats, as do some invasive animals. Climate change is another factor for wildlife on the decline. Climate change is changing, and changing climate is altering precipitation patterns, changing entire ecosystems, causing habitat shifts. Insect populations are crashing with pesticide use and other chemical applications. It's estimated that common bird species numbers alone have declined by 50% in the last 40 years. So every little thing that we can do to protect and restore habitat is helpful and needed. So just one example of habitat loss in Oregon. This slide depicts the distribution of Oregon white oak, which is a priority habitat in the state, in the Willamette Valley ecoregion in particular. The yellow lines on this slide delineate the Willamette Valley ecoregion, and the orange coloration inside the Willamette Valley ecoregion shows historic distribution of Oregon white oak on the left, and historic meaning pre-European settlement, and then current distribution of Oregon white oak habitat on the right. And as you can see, historically, there was a lot more Oregon white oak habitat within the Willamette Valley ecoregion. It's been estimated actually that there's only about 4 to 6% of Oregon white oak habitat remaining in the Willamette Valley. And and remaining oak habitat continues to be threatened from loss, conversion to other uses, continued development, whether it be um, uh, residential development or viticulture. Other threats to remaining oak habitat are related to historical fire suppression, encroachment and overtopping by faster growing species, for example, Douglas fir, and then non-native invasive plant species, which compete for moisture and nutrients and result in simplification of the oak habitat ecosystem. And why should we even care about Oregon white oak habitat loss? Why care is always a really good, important question to ask. And for oak habitat, the reality is that this habitat type is used by over 200 species in native species of birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, insects. These are species that are either dependent upon oak habitat or strongly associated with oak habitat. So if the habitat is not there, or when we have less of this particular habitat, we're going to have fewer of these species that rely upon this important habitat type, including the species here in this slide. Western gray squirrel, chipping sparrow, acorn woodpecker, slender-billed nuthatch. These are all species that are reliant on oak habitat. So when we see declines or degradation of habitat, it affects the critters that rely on that habitat. So now we're going to dig a little deeper into how you can provide the components of wildlife habitat on your land. So a key first step is to go native, provide native vegetation, a variety of native plants, to provide natural sources of food for wildlife species. Native vegetation, it's been estimated, provides 10 to 15 times more food than non-native plants. So there's great value in providing native plants and battling the non-native plants. All right, they often go hand in hand. Native plants, besides providing food of themselves, are provide food for insects, which in turn are important food sources for many wildlife, birds included. And an interesting factoid, about 96% of all terrestrial birds actually rely on insects. They might not eat insects themselves in their adult life forms, but these most birds actually will forage and use insects and feed their young insects, and then those young grow up and eat seeds later on. But insects, super important, and diversity is key. So with a diversity of plants, you get the provision of food at different times of the year. Other sources of food that you can manage for on your land are related to snags and logs. Snags, dead and dying wood, and logs on the ground. These are places where insects are often found, and again, those insects are important food items. Another habitat component to provide on your land is water. Water is essential for wildlife survival. While some species are able to meet their need for water through their food and prey items, some wildlife actually need to regularly drink water. And water becomes extra important during hot, droughty periods, as well as during freezing temperatures. Some species of wildlife forage and find their food in water, like our native turtles need to be in water to swallow their food, and other species need water for successful reproduction. For example, northern red-legged frogs need water to lay their eggs. So water is very important. And water quality and quantity is identified in the Oregon Conservation Strategy as a key conservation issue or a threat facing the survival and health of Oregon's fish and wildlife into the future. Um, so where you have water, streams, wetlands on your property, on your land, um, efforts to protect and restore are encouraged. Um, because wetlands are still being lost. About 40% of Oregon's wetlands have already been drained, diked, or filled since European settlement, and wetland habitat losses are still occurring. Water is being water's overallocated in many watersheds. Other threats include excess nutrients, pollution, erosion, invasive species. All these issues are threats to water suitability for wildlife. So some actions to consider on your property would be to protect water quality, preventing livestock, for example, from entering wetlands and streams to reduce the nutrient input and sedimentation, restore and maintain vegetative buffers along wetlands and waterways, uh, vegetation riparian areas or riparian um, structure cools and cleans water, provides important habitat, and prevents erosion. Where you have American beaver, I know it can be challenging to live with beaver on the landscape, but beaver are a really important component to maintaining and improving water quality. So there are ways to promote beaver on your land, and there are certainly ways to live with, coexist with beaver. And then finally, again, aquatic species, both plants and animals are an issue and do affect water quality. So controlling invasives where they occur on your property is an important step to providing good quality water for wildlife on your land. The next component of wildlife habitat to be thinking about on your land is cover. So cover is the physical structure that provides one or both of the following functions for wildlife: protection from environmental extremes and protection from predators, including humans. Cover could be places where wildlife nest, rear their young, places where wildlife rest, safe from predators or disturbance from people. And when thinking about cover, it's important to it helps to think about the specific species, but generally you want to think about layers from the ground up. So from ground leaf litter all the way up to the upper levels of the tree canopy. Realizing that cover provided by trees is going to benefit some species, while the leaf litter is going to benefit others. And diversity, again, is key. Diversity of plant species, which in turn provides a variety of structural elements that can benefit different wildlife species. So providing vegetation of various heights and ages will provide that diversity and complexity, providing vegetation that's both deciduous and coniferous, woody and herbaceous. Those are all components of diversity and complexity. And then again, snags, dead and dying trees, and logs. These are important cover elements used by usually smaller species of wildlife, but they are important for others too. Managing for patches and edges are are things that you can do. So leaving areas unmowed, for example, or ungrazed to provide that escape cover closer for a particular species. And then adding what we call microhabitat elements are other sources of cover. So I want to spend a bit of time talking more about these micro habitat elements. Snags and stumps in particular. Snags, again, dead and dying trees. They are one of the most limiting habitat elements across the landscape, especially in urban and rural living areas where snags are often removed because they pose a hazard to human structures. Um, but many also have been cut down for firewood or because they're not pleasing to the eye or assumed to be not important. But snags and stumps are also lacking in more rural areas, including managed forests due to historic and currently allowable timber management practices. Um, Snags provide important habitat for what we call cavity nesters, both primary and secondary cavity nesters. Primary being those species of wildlife that actually make the holes in the trees themselves, like woodpeckers is the classic primary excavator, but also secondary cavity nesters or users include owls, western screech owls, squirrels, snags and stumps. And additionally, they serve as perches. They're used as den sites by some mammals. They're used as roosting and overwintering sites for other critters, including bats. Snags and stumps host insects and fungi, which are important food sources for Douglas squirrel, for example, forage on fungi. All stages of decay in a tree provides valuable wildlife habitat. Generally, the bigger the better, but any size of decaying and dying tree is a value. As This slide shows the classic stages of tree decay. You know, live being stage 1 all the way down to stage 9, which is the stump and the down material. But every single one of these stages is um, this tree is still providing valuable wildlife habitat and is important. If these habitat elements occur on the landscape, it's recommended that they be retained and protected. So where snags and stumps do not currently exist, there actually are ways to create them. And that is recommended to create snags and stumps, to promote development of snags and stumps where they don't exist, or just to create more, because generally speaking, from a wildlife habitat perspective, the more snags and stumps, the better. So there are many different ways to do this, and this is a common forestry technique, but one example would be to girdle live trees and let them die in place. Girdling refers to the cutting or removal of the outer cambium layer of around the entire circumference of a tree. Other techniques to create snags include just sawing off a portion of the tree. Another interesting option, as shown in this slide, is what I call the Insta snag technique. This slide shows a large habitat restoration site where there were no trees on the existing site. So trees actually were brought onto the site. Trees with lateral stems were brought onto the site. A hole dug, the tree plopped down into the hole and secured into the ground, and voila, Insta snag. And there are a lot of them. And these are extremely valuable habitat features that'll benefit a lot of critters. you can see this is pretty brand new site. The plants haven't even been, the native plants haven't been replanted, but this site will develop, and these standing snags, as well as the large wood that was placed on the ground, will continue on into the future and provide these important habitat elements. So other microhabitat elements that you can provide on your land are rock piles and logs down trees, down wood, large woody debris, many different names, but logs and rocks. If you have them, protect them, maintain them. If you don't have them, or if there are only a few of them, provide more by bringing logs in, by bringing rock material in. Logs and rocks provide hiding cover and protection from predators. They provide den sites, foraging sites, protection from weather. Some wildlife use them for breeding. I mentioned terrestrial salamanders often will use down wood either under the tree itself or under the peeling bark. Eggs will be laid under the large wood. Also, these structures, these logs and rock piles, serve as basking sites. Rocks in particular retain heat and are favored by different species of reptiles. Reptiles will also forage in them. And hibernacula, places where species overwinter and need protection during their hibernation. These structures provide hibernation spots for critters as well. Downwood and logs are super important for amphibians in particular, because rocks and large wood provide moisture, and amphibians need to stay cool and moist, especially during times of extreme heat and drought, which we're seeing more of here in Oregon. So very important for amphibians. I already mentioned terrestrial salamanders, how they'll lay their eggs under or in decaying wood. The warmth of decaying wood actually helps incubate salamander eggs, so that's really interesting. Another thing to consider about where to place these microhabitat elements, rocks and logs in particular. It's great to have rocks in the sun, and generally rocks in the sun and logs in the shade. That said, it's best to provide a little bit of everything, because the sun moves, the shade moves, things change over time. So it's great to provide rocks, some rock piles in sun and some in the shade, and same with the logs. So again, it's all about diversity and providing more options for more species. Another way that you can provide microhabitat elements on your land is to create habitat piles, or sometimes they're referred to as wildlife brush piles or wildlife piles. But the idea is to provide a bunch of woody material in various sizes and structures and species and diameters, and pile it up and provide a little habitat feature on the landscape, which are super important, very important for a variety of species that are maybe not moving a whole lot, but also are moving across the landscape and need little, what we call stepping stones, hiding places, cover across the landscape so that they can move safely. So here is an example of a habitat pile that a landowner created on their property, and you can see there is larger pieces of sawed trees on the bottom and smaller diameter wood and even branches of fir and cedar piled on top. And this is just A habitat element that is meant to stay on the landscape and decay in place, and it can be added to. So how many piles to provide on your land? Well, between 4 and 8 habitat piles are recommended per acre, and each pile should be about 100 to 150 feet apart. You want to avoid using treated wood. All your habitat piles should be made up of natural trees, uh, pieces of wood and branches. Um, and each pile should be about 3 feet high to 5 feet wide. That's kind of the standard recommendation. And you definitely want to uh, avoid burning these habitat piles. These are habitat features intended for wildlife. So if you need to have a burn pile, that should be a separate spot, a separate pile. Um, but again, these habitat piles are really great ways to provide key components uh, and needs for a lot of different species of wildlife. So the fourth component of wildlife habitat is space. This is the space that wildlife require to find food and water and to raise their young, to move across the landscape safely. Often wildlife need to move between habitat types at different stages of their life, different seasons of the year. So space or freedom to move is a critical thing to be thinking about when planning your habitat restoration plan or your land management activities. Is how that is going to affect um, wildlife movement and use on your land. Um, so some things to think about would be to identify key wildlife movement areas, often riparian areas, those green areas along riparian, like streams and rivers. Riparian areas are often places where animals concentrate to not just to live, but to travel, to move between habitat types or across the landscape. Um, so opportunities to improve um, wildlife movement would be to restore riparian vegetation along uh, streams and rivers and wetlands. So planting native plants, removing invasive plants, connecting patches of habitat, and then adding those microhabitat elements to kind of fill those gaps and to provide those stepping stones across the landscape for those critters so they can move safely and rest and hide and find food along the way. Um, Another thing to think about is where to provide areas of habitat. Ideally, um, we would be encouraging wildlife to occur in areas where they would have minimal human disturbance. You know, that might not be possible on everywhere, but I creating enhancing habitat in places that where critters are not going to be regularly disturbed is ideal. You also want to think about any barriers that might be on your land to wildlife movement, whether it's um, roads, fencing. If you need to use fencing, if you have fencing, think about using wildlife-friendly fence designs, because certain designs, certain styles of fence are barriers to certain species. So things to think about to promote safe movement of different species that are using your land for all or part of its life cycle. So we've looked at the four components of wildlife habitat and um, talked about microhabitat elements and how to incorporate, protect, and incorporate microhabitat features on your land. But now I want to shift gears and focus in on how to provide habitat for certain groups of species, in particular species of greatest conservation need. Um, the first group of species that we're going to look at are grassland birds. Grassland birds are generally one of the most imperiled groups of birds in not just in Oregon, but regionally and globally. And that is because grassland habitat is one of the most imperiled habitat types globally, regionally, and in Oregon, grassland habitat is probably the least protected habitat in the state. Current losses are estimated between 50 and 95%. Um, in the Willamette Valley ecoregion, that number is about 96 to 8% of native grasslands that historically occurred now just do not exist. So those species of wildlife that are dependent upon grassland habitats um, have also suffered and declined. So what to do? How to provide habitat on your land for grassland birds? Well, um, again, habitat, grassland habitat. For most of us, and realistically, it's not going to be possible to restore native grassland. In some situations, it is, and but restoring native grassland habitat honestly can be very difficult and is very expensive because the seeds for those native grasses and forbs are very expensive. And some of the tools in our toolbox to maintain those habitats are just difficult to implement. So, but that said, creating habitat for grassland birds starts with thinking about the size and the shape, the configuration on the landscape of that grassland habitat type, the structure within the grassland. So yes, ideally, native bunch grasses and forbs would be provided and would form the basis of that grassland habitat. But in lieu of that, non-native grasses can be managed to provide the structure and to mimic the natural grassland to provide value to those grassland birds. The forbs and the flowers of those forbs are probably the most realistic component that can be reestablished in grassland habitat restoration efforts. Those forbs provide those flowers and the insects are the food for the grassland birds. I talked previously about the importance of insects. So for example, western meadowlark, Oregon Besserer sparrow, Savannah sparrows, those are all seed-eating birds as adults, but they're eating and feeding insects to their young. So it's the forbs more so than the grasses that are going to provide the food for the insects. So establishing any forbs would be a recommended conservation action on your land. Providing bare spaces. I mean, that's the beauty of these native grasses, that they're called bunch grasses for a reason. They have what we call interstitial spaces. They don't form the thick mats of grasses and thatch that are non-native ag type of grasses do, or lawn grasses do. But these native grasses naturally have spaces and provide bare ground in between them. So any way you can provide bare ground on your land will be beneficial to grassland birds, because they use those bare spots for building their nests. And that's often where the forbs are, or they're foraging on the bare ground because insects land on bare ground, or maybe they're in the ground. Some other things to think about is singing perches. So a lot of these grassland birds, the males are singing to attract the females during breeding season. So they need perches to land on and do their singing and courtship behaviors. And those perches ideally would be um, native plants, but it could be a fence post. It could be a post that you place on your land to provide a perch. It could be artificial. Um, so it doesn't have to be natural. Ideally it would, but it can be um, uh, artificial structure as well that serves as that perch structure to provide that male grassland bird what he needs to sing his song. um, Another thing to keep in mind is um, grasslands historically were maintained, quote unquote, maintained by natural disturbance regimes, flooding, fire. Well, we don't have as many of those these days, but the tools in our toolbox now that kind of mimic those natural disturbance regimes are mowing, haying, prescribed burning. Um, Grazing by livestock in a managed way, in a rotational way, so that the habitat structure in that grassland habitat is is managed to mimic a healthy grassland ecosystem. So some of those disturbances, the mowing, the grazing, the prescribed burning, um, it's recommended that every 3 to 5 years those disturbances occur in order to keep um, woody plants from encroaching and pushing out, shading those grasslands, and to cause the grass to grow. And those are that's just that disturbance is part of that natural cycle, and those are things that you can implement and do on your own land. Keeping in mind that you want to manage your grasslands with the timing of bird nesting in mind. So it's recommended to mow and burn before bird nesting starts or after it's completed. So just keep that in mind when thinking about how to manage grassland habitat for grassland birds. So Oregon's bats are another group of species that are of conservation concern. Bats don't get a whole lot of love and they're misunderstood by many, but they're super important for a healthy ecosystem. And unfortunately, many of them are on the decline. But there are things that we can do on our land to benefit them and to provide for their habitat needs. So the main one would be insects, because that's all that's being eaten by our bats here in Oregon is insects. So related to insects, again, native plants, I've already talked about that. And then water. A lot of insects are associated with water, lay their eggs in water. So protecting and providing clean water is important for bats, can benefit bats. And then roosts. And roosts include this are basically the spots that bats are hanging out during the day, during the night, during the winter, and during the breeding or maternity season. And bats use a variety of different um, spots to roost and to overwinter and to raise their young. But one of the main features that they do use for roosting are large trees, large trees, but then large dead and dying trees, stumps. Bats will use stumps. They'll use logs on the ground. They'll use rock piles. So again, the importance of these microhabitat elements is important for bats as well. Anything you can do to avoid or limit your use of chemicals is beneficial for bats. And then I often get asked about bat boxes, and that is a tool in the toolbox. Ideally, we would have more large trees and dead and dying trees on the landscape, but the reality is we just don't have as many. We don't have enough, not just for bats, but for other critters. So putting up a bat box is a good thing to do. There's no guarantee a bat will find it or use it, but putting up a bat box can provide an important roosting spot for one or more bats. So the next group of species I encourage landowners to consider when managing for wildlife habitat on their land are turtles. Oregon has two species of native turtles, the western painted turtle and the northwestern pond turtle. Both are classified as sensitive critical on our state sensitive species list, and they need both aquatic habitat, water, as well as upland or terrestrial habitats for living out their entire life cycle. ODFW has available on our website a great resource for land managers and landowners. It's called Guidance for Conserving Oregon's Native Turtles, including best management practices, BMPs. So I encourage you to check that out. It's available in a PDF form but that will go through basically in more detail what Oregon's native turtles need in terms of habitat suitability, basking structure, nesting habitat characteristics, providing the aquatic and the terrestrial habitat in close proximity to each other, and thinking about how to provide for safe passage movement of those turtles between those habitat types. But if you do have turtles on your property now, or if you have a wetland or wetland pond on your property, some things that you can do to benefit turtles are adding basking structures. Often there's a lack often of suitable basking structures in a wetland or in a riparian area, so adding structure can benefit turtles. Creating and maintaining suitable nesting habitat is very helpful. Suitable nesting habitat is considered probably the most limiting habitat element for turtles. And improving juvenile rearing habitat or hiding cover in aquatic areas. So little turtles spend a lot of time hiding because they're so small, they're so vulnerable, they have a lot of predators, both natural, like for example, great blue herons will snack on little turtles, but we also unfortunately have a lot of introduced non-native predators, for example, American bullfrog or largemouth bass. Um, these are consumers of little turtles. So anything that you can do to provide more hiding cover, so little basically wildlife piles, but instead of placing them on the land for the terrestrial species, you can actually build little wildlife piles for juvenile turtles to provide them for little hiding places, because little turtles aren't going to be basking and hiding where the big turtles are. Little turtles are going to be in shallow water and using smaller structures. So those are just some recommended habitat actions you can implement on your land for turtles. So I'm going to finish up here with some information on amphibians and how to create enhanced habitat for still water breeding amphibians. So here in Oregon, we have amphibians that lay their eggs, some species of amphibians that lay their eggs in flowing water. We have some species of salamanders that lay their eggs just on land, and they spend their whole life cycle on land. And then we have amphibians, including the northern red-legged frog, which is in this slide, that lay their eggs in still or very slow moving water. So um, Oregon's still water breeding amphibians, they actually just need water primarily for egg laying. And then the rest of their life cycle, they are up on land foraging. Some of these species do forage near the water's edge, but often once they're done with their egg laying in the water, they move back up to their non-breeding habitat, which is going to be in the uplands, so shrubby forested areas or habitat piles, places where there's deep leaf litter, where they can stay moist and cool and find food to eat, food being insects and invertebrates, worms, things like that. So some things to think about would be if you have wetlands that are currently being used by amphibians for breeding, and you would know that by finding their egg masses, looking for and identifying their egg masses. Well, you want to protect. I mean, the goal is to protect and maintain known breeding sites. It's always best to protect what already exists, right? That said, build it and they will come. So there are many examples of um, creating wetlands or enhancing wetlands to improve conditions, and these amphibians are very mobile. They will move and they will colonize suitable habitat. So if you don't currently have amphibians, native amphibians in your wetlands, it is possible to attract them if they have a safe way to get to it. Connectivity is important. Um, but so providing clean water, cool water, water at the right time of the year, providing um, sticks and grasses where egg masses can be attached are important things to think about. Maintaining sunny areas, because those eggs are developing from the heat provided by the sun. So it's important to leave some sun um, in along the riparian areas and along the wetlands. And then again, providing those little stepping stones between the aquatic breeding habitat and the upland non-breeding habitat in the form of habitat piles, logs, stumps, um, rock piles. So those are some recommended actions you can implement on your land that will benefit amphibians. So when developing a wildlife habitat plan or incorporating wildlife habitat into your land management plan, a good first place to start is to find out what you have, to inventory your existing habitat types, the plants that currently occur, any unique habitat features that currently exist. It might be a mature Oregon white oak tree, it might be a rock pile, it might be a snag. You want to make note of any existing structures, um, roads, utilities. Basically, identify what is there currently. And then also think about your soil type and any microclimate conditions of the site that might influence how habitat can be restored or established. Different soil types are more conducive to certain types of plant communities. North-facing slopes are different than south-facing slopes. So those are important considerations. Creating a list of species that you know exist on your property. Start keeping, if you haven't already, a list of species that you've seen on your property. Make note of the time of the year that you've seen it, because that will help inform how that particular species is using. You know, is it just using your property for um, moving, migration, or is it nesting there? I mean, not that one is more important than the other, but knowing how a particular species is using your property can help inform your plan for managing habitat. Um, and based on what you know about those different species, that can help you um, get a better handle on opportunities for enhancement. So, based on your existing habitat functions, you can, and your understanding or the expertise that you get outside, um, you can better understand. Okay, what does a species need that my land is not providing that I can start providing? And then think about your goals. What are your constraints, your goals, any threats that might occur and influence what you do on your land that you have no control over? Um, and then filter that all together and come up with your habitat goals. Maybe you do want to target certain species or groups of species like oak dependent species. Identify those goals and then identify actions that will help achieve those goals. Goals or actions that can be implemented throughout the year to achieve the habitat and species goals. And then another thing to keep in mind is, again, just to acknowledge that often we do things that have unintentional consequences for wildlife habitat, but for the critters in particular. Some of the things that we do may be beneficial, but some of them might not be. So just think about um, how what we do might affect the critters that we're targeting, or maybe not even targeting, in terms of timing of, say, mowing. And then the last but not least step of developing a plan and implementing a plan is monitoring and adaptive management. Because every site's different, no one knows it all. Critters, I mean, we know a lot about habitat and different species needs, but the reality is we're all still learning. So monitoring is so helpful and important because it allows us to adjust um, and change and hopefully improve. So in summary, wildlife habitat is important, and habitat loss is one of the main reasons, the main threats facing Oregon's wildlife, and the reasons why many species are on the decline. It's because we've experienced so much habitat loss, conversion, fragmentation. It's still occurring. There is a lot of great restoration work going on. I don't want to overlook that. There's a lot of great work being done on private lands and public lands, but there's more that needs to be done. There's more that can be done, and everyone has a role in wildlife conservation. And there's so many opportunities out there. So, um, in summary, I just want to highlight again the importance of native plants, battling the non-natives, providing clean water, um, providing safe spaces for wildlife, keying in on those microhabitat elements that I spent a lot of time on. Those are a great way to, and pretty easy things to actually incorporate into on your land into a habitat management plan, regardless of the size of your property. Um, and it is important, as I mentioned previously, to inventory what you have. Evaluate your existing conditions, develop your plan, monitor, and adjust and enjoy the critters that use your property. And feel free to reach out to me via email or phone if you need any more information or have any questions about Oregon's non-game wildlife or how to provide wildlife habitat on your land. I'd be happy to provide assistance. Um, Also, I encourage you to check out the Oregon Conservation Strategy. There's a lot of great information in the strategy for everyone. Um, you can find information more about your geographical area, strategy, habitats, species, recommended conservation actions for each species. Also, that last link there on the screen is for habitat resources specific to ODFW. So I encourage you to check that out. There's some other resources available through our habitat program. So thanks for having me. I look forward to hearing any questions that might be sent my way, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks again.